Okay, all right, we've had quite a few participants join, so thanks everyone for listening to our banter. A window into the worlds of Charlene and Akin there. So very formally, welcome to our second conversation in Pencils Down, which is part of our NeueHouse and MA group series that gives a little bit of a window into the worlds of creatives. We look at their latest work, how it's sort of contextualized within the broader universe, and really what makes them tick. So today, I'm very privileged to be here with Charlene Prempeh, and I'm going to read off a sheet because both of our panelists have so many talents. I need to read down their different attributes. Charlene is an editor, a creative consultant, a founder of a vibe called Tech, a contributing editor to the FT. Akinola Davies Jr. is a photographer, a Sundance award-winning and Bafta-nominated filmmaker, a curator and a music consultant. And we'll be discussing, as I say, their latest work and integrating diversity and broadening the cultural lens in creative campaigns and content. I'd just like to bring to everybody's attention, there's a little raise hand symbol at the bottom of the screen. We encourage you to write your questions in there. No swearing, please. And about 10 minutes before the end of the session, I'll moderate some of those questions and put them to the panel here. So to kick things off, both of you, Charlene and Akin, you clearly have many, many talents. What are your paths and what really took you to this high achieving place that you both now occupy? And also who inspired you along the way? Akinola, should we start with you?
I was going to be like, oh, do you, Charlie?
Yeah, I was going to do the same.
You know, I was thinking about this because I get asked this question a lot, and I don't really have much in the way of sort of outward facing inspiration. That's why it becomes a really tricky question if I try and answer. But I would say that probably a lot of the inspiration is maybe similar to Charlene in a way. It's kind of community focused. It's kind of trying to just replace what I think, replace value systems, basically. I think that's kind of how I would look at the sort of the genesis of what I was trying to do when I first started off, without maybe being able to articulate that at that period in time. You know, so if you read my bio, it has a lot to do with like spirituality and sexuality but I think ultimately it was just trying to find a way to express notions of community, notions of family, try and infuse that with as much critical thought as possible. And yeah, most of the motivation came out of not seeing myself in a lot of places and maybe being rejected from a lot of places. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe there's a lot of similarity in what you do as well, Charlene, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's funny, like I'm in a very particular frame of mind because like I had like a therapy session this morning. So it was like, it's funny because it puts you in a mode. So thinking a lot about like your role in things, right? And yeah, this idea of like trying to carve out like a space for yourself and trying to create a world where you feel seen and tell stories around your community, I think definitely is what has been like the ongoing thread in like all the work that I've done, and not necessarily even the creative work, just even places that I felt like I wanted to be. So like I remember when I was like, I don't know, I must have been 16 or like a bit younger, but making the decision to apply to Oxford and being terrified, but really wanting to kind of like like wanting to self-actualize and like see myself there and make that okay. I think just there's always just kind of nuances of that in like definitely in the work that I do now. It's like how can you integrate like the Black experience into like all parts of the world, and specifically into spaces that previously it feels that we've been exempt from. So yeah, you're right. It's definitely my inspiration too.
Just even listening to that, it's very much like trying to pull back the curtain on a load of smoke and mirrors, because because kind of coming into things when I was hearing you speak, it was like I remember on some of the bigger jobs I've done, just being like absolutely terrified leading up to them, and then kind of getting there and being like, oh, this is not that deep, you know. It's actually I can exist in this space, and I can sort of like project a lot of ideas in this space. So yeah, I totally empathize with that.
And I think, and I don't know how you felt in the past, but there's very much this sense, I think a lot of like Black creatives and just Black professionals actually talk about this, of like the whole imposter syndrome thing, right? And like feeling, and to avoid that, feeling like they have to be like at such an insane level to even like enter an industry or like do a particular job. Whereas there's like an entitlement that some other people feel often in terms of like what they're able to achieve and how good they are. I remember, I can't remember who the director was, but I think she was Chinese American, and she was pitching a film. And her friend said to her, just go in there and like pitch it like a mediocre white man, like with all the confidence of a mediocre white man. Yeah. And then she was talking about this in the interview. And I'm interested, like when you were, so like, let's take a step back. Congratulations on the Sundance Award for your film, for Lizard. Like it's a huge achievement. And like, I hope you're like incredibly, insanely proud of yourself, because you should be. But when you were like pitching, all the pats, all of them, when you were pitching that film to people and like working out like people you wanted on board or funding or whatever, how confident did you feel in the idea?
I think, you know what, at that point in time, fairly confident, I would say, because a lot of the trajectory up until that point was a lot of self-investment. Coming back to that thing about rejection, is that I had to figure out systems and strategies about how to sort of like manifest my dreams in a quite pragmatic way.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with access and resources, you know. It's like when you don't have access and you don't have the resources, like you kind of have to really think outside the box. And the problem with, and what really kind of got me excited was the fact that loads of people just thought my ideas were really impractical. And I was like, well, it's actually really practical if you simplify it and you remove all these veils. So up until that point, I'd been partially self-funding projects for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the most sustainable thing to do, because you end up being broke predominantly for a lot of time. But one, it builds commitment to what you're doing, and B, you kind of totally remove the smoke and mirrors. So I knew what the economy of shooting a film was. I knew how to treat cast and crew, because they're mainly doing you favors, you know, so you treat everyone with like a certain level of respect. And equally, I kind of been to a point where I was really confident with image making, or at least my style to that point of image making, that set wise and production wise and post wise, I felt really confident.
Yeah.
So actually, you know, coming back to your question, the genesis of that initial conversation of Lizard, it was actually the opposite for me. It was more like I met these 2 brilliant women who were the heads of BBC Films, attempting to pitch them this idea, like nervously pitch them this idea. And they were just like, we don't want to see anything, but when you're ready to make a film, we want to help. And actually, I was a bit floored by that, because I was like, what? like how is that even possible? I was like, I never made anything. So I think that experience filled me with a lot of confidence, and actually just like them contextualizing that I had been shooting a lot of short form stuff, narrative short form stuff without my sort of knowledge. That kind of also filled me with a lot of confidence, you know, and I think that's what I've taken forward. But once again, kind of, you know, weaving into your question, what we open up about, it's kind of like taking up space, feeling more confident about taking up space, and how you can choose to take up space, and what sort of community you can foster when you take up space. I think all those things are becoming more, what's the word? More, becoming easier to navigate. Not easier, but less anxiety inducing to navigate.
Yeah.
Which kind of also makes me wonder about tech, you know, because when it comes to what you're doing with a vibe called tech, it's like, it's a very sort of like white space, tech, you know. I mean, like, when I talk about my aesthetic before, everyone would always say, oh, your stuff is so DIY and your stuff is so blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, it's only DIY because I can't afford to sort of play with all these like toys and stuff, you know? And when I talk about the stuff I want to do now, people are like, oh, but it's not your style. I was like, yeah, but my style was determined by that. So I wonder, in terms of tech, like your relationship with trying to like push more in that space, because Black people have always existed in that space, but maybe haven't been so prevalent.
Yeah, it's like, tech's a weird one, isn't it? Because I think the side of it, there's definitely like the creative side, which I've like done some work on like in the past, like with the piece that I think I mentioned to you when we chatted before, and that was looking specifically at like Black creativity technology. And to your point, it was asking questions like, how do things work when it comes to access? Especially as tech gets more and more developed, right? So like at any given moment, there is like a specific thing that everyone's jumping on. So that might be like, it kind of peaks up and down, but like VR, for example. And everyone's like, yeah, we need to do a VR film, we need to do VR. And like the access to that technology and like the training to that technology is absolutely determined by like financial access. Right? That's kind of what the basis of it is. And sadly, but inevitably, that would mean that lots of Black creatives, at least at the beginning of their careers, will be excluded, right? Because like they're less like likely to be in a situation where daddy's just going to get them a VR camera and like let them like get on with it.
Yeah.
So, but on the like flip side of that, technology has like meant, like the ubiquity of technology has meant that like you could go out and do those DIY films, and they were still kind of like good enough to like be in like important places and in spaces that people could consume them.
100%.
So it's like, it's just, I think it's just like, it's important to like keep an eye on it. So like as new technologies develop, like how like schemes and organizations can be created that make sure that there's a certain level of equity in like who has access and who gets to develop their practice. Because you don't want to be in a world where like everyone's using VR, but like different communities haven't had a chance to develop their creativity in that space.
Yeah, and it excites me of this idea of a tech space predominantly being more accessible, because I sort of wonder, so me, I use myself for example, so like the ideas I'm trying to create, once, I always used to say this quite early on, as a filmmaker, I'm so new to being aware of the tools at my disposal, because I haven't necessarily had access to a lot of tools. So now it's like, when I start conceiving more things, I'm like, oh wow, like I could potentially do that, you know. I think what you just said about the ubiquity of it is that it kind of, at least for me, when you kind of like approach stuff with intention and you kind of have, you know, where there's the means to do it, you can start pushing a lot of that imagination, you know, what I consider even Afrofuturist, which is like the Black radical imagination. It's like you haven't had access to so much, so you become so creative in how you problem solve, so that when you finally do get the access, it feels almost limitless in its potential, you know?
This kind of like mind-blowing moment.
Yeah,
Do you feel like, I think definitely like technology is a one part of that, one facet of that, right? This kind of idea of like the mind being blown in terms of what you're able to do. But do you feel that what's happened over the past year, that there's an element of that mind-blowing, I can do anything with Black creatives at the moment? This sense that like a new space has opened up?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that for our generation and maybe the generation after, I feel like we coming into a lot of eureka moments, you know, like those of us, particularly who maybe went from like no internet to dial-up internet to broadband internet. Do you know what I mean? I feel like when you see that picture of like the Neanderthal become modern man, I feel like we've been accelerated in that space.
Yeah.
But the next generation, they're growing up on swipe screens and stuff like that. So I kind of think that in the last year there's been a lot more access, I would say, in terms of running parallel to a lot of sort of like the political dialogue in zeitgeist, you know, and those sort of conversations about equality. So I think there's been a lot of doors open up, and I think in that vein, yes, there's a lot more possibility. I think maybe what I'm curious about is kind of seeing that possibility once again with intention. You know, I think that I heard you say something maybe a little while ago about how data and technology can help the Black community in terms of like therapy or like protecting us or as forms of protest. So I'm kind of like, that's the sort of stuff that I'd be even more excited to sort of figure out. But even like for me, I would probably say I am more, I feel like, you know, with the sort of trajectory of way things go, I feel like I'm potentially at this point maybe one step away from being able to access something, which for me feels quite exciting. You know, I might be a few steps away, but at least to me, well, it's mainly because it's just the way my mind works. I always think of puzzles and strategies. So I'm like, oh, okay, that costs like $1 billion to make. So how would we make that on the fly for cheap, basically?
Yeah, like $1 million.
Or even less, because if I can figure out how to make that without those resources, then by the time I'm put in that position of those resources, then I'll already have a bit of a shorthand with the sort of discourse of like how, you know, the language of how you sort of use that. So, I mean, I think in general terms, I think a lot more Black creatives are seeing that their ideas, and maybe, you know, even through like my successes or other filmmaker successes or other platforms coming, is that there's a lot more sense that actually our stories and the way we want to go about things have a value within our communities and also have a value within capitalism as well, basically.
I think that's such a, like an important point, because I think it's been said of like, I'm sure by many people, but for such a long time, there was this idea that only Black people would be interested in Black people's stories, right? So that like they had to be captured and told in this very, very specific space. And I think like with your film Lizard, and like Get Out, all the various like films, like Black Panther's an obvious one, like when you look at all of these different things, it's like, it's quite clear that like Black stories, a good story is a good story. Like good art is good art. And I think people need to, like, both brands and like cultural gatekeepers just need to have a bit more trust in their audience. It's like, if they think that people can spend X amount of time like watching a pig like speak on like some kind of cartoon, then like they should accept that people might be interested in like the experience of like a young girl in a church in Nigeria. Do you know what I mean? Like there's such, for a long time, there's been such niche subjects explored. And it feels to me like it's a really great time now for like what's the right word? The complexities of like different Black communities, that to be explored now. And this idea there is no one like universal Black experience, and like there's a lot of very interesting Black experiences that are worth focusing on.
100%. It's like that conversation. It's like you just said about equity, you know, it's like ultimately at this point in humanity, we know more about the white experience than we do about the Black or other ethnic experiences, you know, or indigenous experiences. And I think that we only gain a sense of value in, and probably can answer a lot of the ills that we're facing in the world by like engaging in those dialogues. You know, I think that ultimately for me as a Black filmmaker or as a filmmaker, I want to empower my community. I want to give them that sort of like creative equity to be able to just like go for those stories, not trying to do something that a different audience is interested in, you know. It's like, but yeah, I mean, go on.
I was just thinking that I like, in many, because I think often it's talked about in a negative way, and that like, oh, like, and it's true, it's like a problem that Black stories haven't been told, don't get me wrong, it's a huge problem, hence why we're trying to tell them. But also what it does allow is for this huge playground. Like in terms of like ideas, like original ideas to come up with and like discuss and put into the mainstream, there's just like, there are millions.
100%. Like, I think there are millions, and there's a tapestry of rich ideas, but actually it reminds me of something that also you've said is like, and also something you referenced at the start of the call, like therapy, you know. I think like, for example, seeing yourself reflected in a system and valued in a system does a lot for your mental health. It does a lot for how you see yourself. It does a lot for how you carry yourself in the world. It does a lot for the narrative of other people seeing you in the world. Yeah. And actually, I think that just, you know, just kind of being able to sort of like reinstate our stories in the manner we want to tell our stories, in the manner of lighting we want to be seen, in our vernaculars, in our dialects, in the way we wear our hair, the way we dress. I think it's at a bit of a crucial stage, you know, because if this is the generation that kind of imbued sort of anxiety because of this like a mass of data being pumped at them, then we probably need, you know, I wouldn't say everyone, but I see it as a sense of responsibility for my community to produce images where they see themselves. And maybe that starts to kind of chip away at a lot of these self-loathing, misogynoir, you know, like, you know, spiritually sort of like castrated sort of notions, you know. I think, you know, I think we're at a point where, I don't know, we're at a point in an intersection where we can start to sort of manifest and put ideas to where we want to be and where we want to see ourselves and how we want to do that.
I think like,
now I have to be timekeeper here. We have 4 minutes left. How time flies when conversation is flowing. So if anybody wants to type more questions, just type them into the Q&A. I have 2.
Questions? Okay.
But Charlene, sorry, I don't want to stop your flow.
No, like, go ahead. Let's go with the question.
Well, so one of the questions is quite topical. Akinola, you had an amazing series on the BBC called Black to Life. Now, I know all about this because I have watched it and I'm fascinated and did my research. But can you tell Charlene and everybody here what your inspiration was and what you were trying to achieve?
Sure. It's just like the conversation around, I grew up in Nigeria, so a lot of the history that I learned in schools was like Nigerian history, right? Ultimately from a colonial point of view, but coming over here, like, you know, people wanted to tell me about like Henry VIII and cutting heads off. And to me, that's just really boring because I think that there were actually sort of like Black people that existed within those spaces. So I kind of created images that wanted to do that, but couldn't find an outlet to do it. And luckily through Liv Little, who was at Galdem working with the BBC, they wanted to create a digital program that could be shared, that could be for a younger generation and kind of sat in the sort of vestitude of the music video. So I worked with Boalia Abigail Newton and people who are sort of like well-known within their kind of social scenes to kind of tell the stories of these people who existed within like Tudor and Victorian times, and kind of just honor their legacies.
Amazing. I would encourage everyone to look that one up. And Charlene, we're curious to know what is next for you. And then I have a couple of other questions just to give you the heads up.
What is next? The creation of a pasta dinner for my son. No.
Very important.
Very important. No. So there's lots of stuff. So myself and the creative director at a Vital Tech, an amazing guy called Lewis Gilbert, we're carrying on our great mission, right? So like, how can we tell like Black stories? How can we tell new Black stories that are authentic? And at the moment, that means that we're working with an amazing publisher, actually, on a campaign with a Black author. So we're really excited about that. There's a whole piece of research being done about, and this is more about the tech stuff, about the Black experience with technology in the UK, and how it affects kind of systemic issues like mental health and physical health and financial health. So it's just like digging away, basically, like making Black stories super visible and important.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions. Should we just try and rattle them off quickly?
Totally, and we can go over as well.
Okay, we can go over. Okay, that's
fine.
We can go over, but I need to run to pasta making.
Oh yeah.
Go on.
No. Okay. Someone says maybe we'll just do like a quick fire round.
Go on.
Do you think there's a value in residency spaces to get access to all this informally? We've spoken about a space a lot. That's essentially what a residency is. Do you think there is value in residency spaces, Charlene?
Yes, I do. I think it's really important. I think access and like financial backing is basically what residency space is. And I think it's super important.
Okay, next question. Do you feel the
terminology? You answer the next one.
Okay.
I can't see them.
They're in the questions. I'll answer it. Do you feel the terminology to discuss POC, WOC, and by POC will be one for the ages, or do you feel it will evolve? That's a tough one. I mean, I hope it evolves because I think it kind of homogenizes everyone into like these groups. But I think at the same time, yeah, I mean, I hope it evolves. That probably answers the question.
Okay, I will pose another question to you because I've found the questions now. Someone, Rachel Barrett, has a question about the issue of audience. The speakers touched on the prevalence of Black stories being told now that there are so many to tell. I was surprised to come across this response still today, Ari, what's the audience, when encouraging a look into hidden non-Western histories. Do the speakers have any advice on how to respond to this question when posed?
So I would say that in terms of, I don't know, I feel like history is kind of fabricated to a point and it's always told by the victors. And I think that ultimately everyone has a stake in each other's history. And I think that the sooner we start discussing this sort of like varied contribution that everyone has made to each other's history, the more rounded our histories and the more depth and texture our histories will actually have. Because at the moment, history kind of creates this like, for a group of people, this sense of entitlement, and for another group of people, this like abyss of self-knowledge. And I think we need to like rebalance those, because the entitled need to kind of learn more about, you know, what everyone's contributed, and we need to centralize the history of those who maybe don't have a lot of that in access.
And just to add to that, I just think it's hugely, I would just be like, it's hugely just lacking in imagination. And also just assuming that everyone only like is so egocentric that all they care about is like where they came from and what that means like for their family and people like who are like them. And like, I'd like to think that's humanity is bigger than that. Yeah. So that's what I would say if someone asked me that ridiculous question in a meeting.
I think people are more curious than that, actually. And as you say, it's a big world. All right. That was amazing. Rapid fire questioner.
Good call, Akinola. Good call.
Really good call. So We can now wrap only 2 minutes over. I want to thank you so much for a really rich, thought-provoking conversation. For the participants, this will be recorded, edited, and emailed to you. And if you want further information about Charlene or Akinola, you can get hold of me at louisa@maworldgroup.com. But yeah, thank you for joining. Thank you for participating. And we wish you a very lovely day wherever you are.